Good morning, everyone. My name is Rosie Goldsmith, and welcome to this morning's first event in our festival where we're looking at the topic Fragmented World, City and Country. And my two guests today I've brought over personally in my luggage from England. They both fitted in very neatly, and I'm very pleased to have them here because I think it's going to be a really interesting debate where we really tackle head-on this idea of living in a divided world, do we, question mark, between town, city and country. On my right here is Sarah Langford, and you've already met Rowan Moore, possibly, who's just to her right. And very quickly, a short introduction before we get onto the topic. Sarah is a barrister and a farmer. She's the author of 2 books and has just got her graduate diploma in agriculture, so congratulations on that. And Sarah will tell us her story of how she went from being a city girl to running a farm. It's an amazing story. And so Sarah's books, In Your Defense, Stories of Life and Law, and Rooted, which is this book here, How Regenerative Farming Can Change the World. And these books you'll be able to buy because there's a very clever system of using a QR code to order up books. So I can't recommend them highly enough, this one and Property by Rowan Moore. Now, Rowan Moore is the award-winning architecture critic of The Observer newspaper and author of Slow Burn City, Why We Build, and Property. And we'll be mostly speaking about his book Property and possibly Slow Burn City as well. I won't tell you an awful lot more about their Wikipedia entries, so to speak, because I'd love you to hear more from them themselves. Now, Sarah, I said you went from being a city girl to the farm. It's not that simple, I know. Tell us about your move from city to country. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, it was a complete accident. I didn't have fantasies of running after chickens and ducks and having... I know that the hashtag cottagecore has a huge following, apparently, on social media. I was not following it. It happened by accident. I had 2 very small children. My youngest son was 8 months old. My other son was 2. And I was writing my first book, In Your Defense, about the 10 years I'd spent as a criminal and family barrister. And then my husband lost his job, and we found ourselves in this very febrile atmosphere in London after the 2017 snap election, having bought a house that was so decrepit, we could have probably done with Rowan at that point, but couldn't live in it.
And he doesn't build houses, I don't
think. No, but he gives very...
He did once, he can advise.
Advice, yeah. And thought we would escape to the Suffolk countryside, which is on the east of England, where we had been going back and forward for the whole of my marriage, because that's where my husband grew up. And thought that we would sort of stay there for 6 months, and it didn't really work out like that. And so when we were there, being kind of largely unemployed, we asked if we could take on the running of some arable land and some pasture land that belongs to my husband's father. He had just bought the arable land, having had a long ambition to be a farmer, and at the age of 81 had just realized it. And so we thought, well, you know, we're here, unemployed, how hard can it be? And what I suppose I had not imagined was both that we were doing this at one of the biggest changes in farming in 2 generations, because of Brexit, we were moving away from the common agricultural policy to Michael Gove's policy of public money for public good. So you were no longer going to get money for owning land.
Sorry to interrupt. This is all under the Conservative government of the time. So 2017?
Yes.
2017, just before
predates,
Brexit had happened, or we'd voted for it.
Yes, exactly. And you would now only get money for how you look after that land, which included how you farmed. But no one knew how they were going to do that. And it has, some would argue that remains, but it has taken a long time for it to come in. But there would be a new way of earning money, not earning money, of being paid subsidy, which is called the Sustainable Farming Incentive. So after 4 or 5 years of Brexit, half of the cheque in December, half of the value would be coming in. So it was an enormous change. I was also very aware, having moved from the city, that every third article I read in The Guardian told me that farmers were pretty much the main culprits responsible for all ecological catastrophe. And then we found ourselves in charge of 250 acres of pretty fertile Suffolk farmland, and most of the press, I suppose, had convinced me that I should probably rewild it, which was the new vogue in England at the time, thanks to the Knepp estate in Sussex. But I grew up the granddaughter of farmers. I grew up in Hampshire, which is on completely the other side of the country, and my grandfather had taken on his tenancy 5 years after wartime rationing ended. And he was absolutely sure over his life that his job, which actually was probably more like a duty or a calling, was to make as much food as he could from the land that he farmed. My uncle took on that farm and then wrote about farming in Farmers Weekly, which is the Bible if you're a farmer. And so that part of my background was very, very rooted in farming. And so I held these two completely opposite philosophies in my hands. One which was a background where my family had spent their whole lives working to try and make as much food as possible in a way that they were told was the right way to do it and paid to do it. And on my other hand, I heard the city narrative and saw what was happening outside the window in the ravages of climate change. And I suppose I set about trying to work out who was right. And in that journey, I came across this, at that point, very quiet revolution that was happening, not just in England, in America and Canada and other parts of Europe, where farmers had got to a point where they financially could not afford to keep farming with lots of very expensive inputs like artificial fertilizers and pesticides. And they weren't working anyway because there had been inevitable biological resistance developed to the weeds that they were trying to kill and so on. And so they had tried to find what was being called a new way, but like all new ways, it's not. It's old. And the techniques within it, often indigenous techniques, have been practiced all over the world because we call farming conventional, but it's been conventional in that way for 70 years. It's a post-war convention. So I had to persuade my literary agent, who was extremely enthusiastic about me writing a very lucrative crime thriller series, that I didn't want to write about people being murdered. I wanted to write about this world that I found myself in because all life was there. And I thought not only did the people that I had met, whose stories I write in Rooted, they taught me how the techniques of farming, sure, but they also taught me philosophies about how to look at life, how to sit on your hands, how not to control everything, how to develop a relationship, not just with the community around you, but with the land, how to feel rooted, how to feel at home in a place which is not your home, where you did not grow up. And I thought when we moved back to the city after our house had been finished in 2019, into a mental health crisis, into the preempt, I suppose, of COVID, I thought about all of this wisdom that I had learned from people that no one would ever meet or know about, which could apply to so many other areas. And so I had to break it to my literary agent, who just held her hands up and went, absolutely not. No one cares about farming, and no one's going to read about farming. And so I gently persuaded her that it was about more than farming. And the irony is that that was 2019, and I don't think I even put the word regenerative farming in the title. Fast forward to where we are now, you have most of the big food companies in the world, Nestle, PepsiCo, Unilever, all pledging to move all of their farms to regenerative farming. You have a framework within the Sustainable Farming Incentive in the UK, which is basically all based around the principles of regenerative farming. You have Jeremy Clarkson, who is a TV personality turned farmer, who has the highest streamed show on Amazon Prime, talking about regenerative farming.
If you haven't met Jeremy Clarkson yet, it's well worth indulging in a little bit of online glory, because he's best known for the farming series now, but also a series called
Top Gear.
Top Gear,
Yeah.
about cars. Yeah.
Yes, so he has brought basically a petrolhead audience over to the idea that soil is the basis upon which most of us depend.
And you've done the same sort of thing.
Well, maybe
not gone
just
from Top Gear.
with less swearing, but
yes.
Yes, I think the idea of taking these concepts which feel like they shouldn't apply to most of us. 1% of the British workforce is, or rather, agriculture represents 1% of the British workforce, but looks after 70% of our land. And their disconnect, and I guess this taps into the theme of this entire talk, the disconnect between people who eat food and people who make it is so vast that most people don't think about food as food, I think, anymore. When a pint of beer costs more than a chicken and bottled mineral water costs more than milk, the value of food is gone. It's something that we eat. It's not something we nourish ourselves with, and it's certainly not something that we think, if we create it like this or like this, it has a profound and real effect on the air quality, water, the ability for soils to hold water, on our daily lives. We're very cut off from the land. And I think that's why it's got an incredibly punchy subtitle, I realize. But that's why I think this sort of method of reconnecting people with the food that they eat through land, through farming, through knowing about it, has an enormous potential to change all sorts of areas of our life.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And you can tell already from that brief introduction, Sarah speaks as wonderfully as she writes. Both these books are absolutely must-reads. They're fantastically written as well. And the stories you tell of the farmers you meet and your friends and family, and the history of farming in England as well is absolutely fascinating. And hopefully we'll talk more about that. Rowan, taking you back to a few years to how your life started. You didn't start in the city.
No.
You were a country boy.
Yes.
So tell us about your background and how you then turned to architecture.
Okay. So I grew up in Sussex, which is southeast of England, about 100 kilometres from London. And I lived next to a farm. And until I was 6 years old, if we wanted milk, I had to take a bucket to the cowshed and get it filled up. And so when milk bottles, we first started, the farmer switched to sheep, and so we started getting milk delivered in bottles, and I just thought that was the most kind of exotic thing ever, to get actual milk bottles. And I loved it, but also it was a little bit dull and actually not very sociable. There weren't an awful lot of people around. And I've lived almost all my adult life in London. And I think I sort of transferred, you know, if you grew up in the countryside, you probably have an attachment to the land around you. And I think I've transferred some of that feeling to London, to the city, because I do have that sort of sense of belonging to it.
You feel that same sense of belonging in the city as you did
Yes.
in the country?
Well, now more so. I find I'm a bit uncomfortable in the country now, for reasons we can discuss. Anyway, and I took up architecture. I was fascinated by it. I loved it. But I discovered I was better at writing about it than actually doing it. So that's how I ended up where I am now. And also my interest in architecture has always been, a big part of it has been the way in which architecture responds to, reflects and shapes society, people, the way we live. So although I love to see a kind of beautiful building and analyze what's beautiful about it, I'm also very interested in how it came into being and what effects it then has. And then the motivation behind this book is, so I spent my whole life living in what Margaret Thatcher called the property-owning democracy, or rather my whole adult life. So, she came to power. The first election in which I voted was the election that she first won. I didn't vote for her, but she had this big idea of the property-owning democracy, which is if everyone owns property, they will be richer and happier and freer, and also they'll be better members of, not members of society, because she didn't think society existed, but I guess better subjects of the nation, because they would be motivated to make sure that what went on around them didn't affect their property values. So the theory was, if you own property, you have a stake in the economy. You therefore want the economy to do well, and you don't want any sort of undesirable elements kind of rocking the boat. So that was her concept, and it was sort of phenomenally successful in many ways. And she implemented various policies to encourage people to own. She brought in the right to buy, which is if you lived in social housing, if you lived in housing that belonged to government, local government, you had the right to buy it at a discounted rate. That was, many people took that up. That was a very big change. And then she also deregulated the mortgage markets so that it was easier to borrow money, which then it enabled more people to buy, but it also enabled house prices to go up or encouraged them to go up. And a whole culture was created in the 1980s of sort of kind of a fever almost, of you had to own, prices were going up all the time. If you weren't an owner, you were a sort of secondary member of society. And you also had to own, because if you didn't buy now, then in 2 years' time, things would be even more expensive and you would sort of lose out. And you wouldn't get onto this word, the property ladder. And then it all crashed in the late 80s. But that policy of really promoting home ownership was then taken on by successive governments, both Labour and Conservative, from then until now. And everyone thought, Margaret Thatcher thought inflation was a bad thing. She was very proud of lowering the rate of inflation for everything except houses, and house price inflation was seen as a good thing. And you would have, until quite recently, you have front pages of newspapers saying, fantastic, house prices have gone up 15%. And also there were advantages for the government in tax-raising terms, revenue-raising terms, because it helped to run the economy. If house prices kept going up, then homeowners would sort of feel rich. They could borrow against the sort of theoretical value of their homes, spend it on whatever they wanted to spend it on. So that would keep the economy turning over. And So all kinds of governments like that, because it's an easy way to sort of boost growth. But there's a price to be paid, which is house prices either they can't go on forever, go on going up forever, in which case there's a kind of reckoning to be paid at some point, or they do, in which case more and more people are excluded from beginning to get onto the property ladder. And so we're now in a situation where there's a very big division between people who own and people who don't, which is a generational divide. And it also has regional characteristics. So there's huge differences between the value of property in different parts of the country. And I think this has created quite an extreme situation where also property values have a disproportionate influence on other decisions. So, people are more and more, I write in the book about an argument that broke out in a country town in England. On the one hand, there was a lesbian couple who had a cockerel, and there was a man who lived near them, and he was upset because the cockerel was making too much noise. And you might say, well, you live in the countryside, noise of chickens is something you have to live with. But he then started harassing this couple, playing really loud music at them, including When a Man Loves a Woman. There's a whole, obviously, quite a transparent sort of gender-based, sexuality-based subtext to all of this. But my point is, he took them to court, or I think they took him to court for harassment. And his argument was that the woman's cockerel was taking £50,000 off the value of his house. And so that's a kind of row that could have broken out anyway, but because of property prices, it gets put through the prism of property values. And this can happen, somebody wants to open a centre for people with disabilities or for recovering drug addicts, or they want to open a bar, or something that's a little bit annoying in some ways, maybe for the neighbours. And again, that gets filtered through property values. So it makes people more likely to go to resist anything that is sort of not quite convenient for them. And I think that's a kind of negative effect. And this idea that property owning makes you a good citizen, that Margaret Thatcher had, at that point, is no longer true, because it makes people selfish and less public-spirited. And I've lived through all of that. I bought a flat in the kind of fever of the 1980s that I couldn't really afford. Then there was a crash, so I lost quite a lot of money. I thought, oh my God, I'm done for. But I kind of managed to buy somewhere else after a few years, very cheaply, which I still own. So I ended up being, and that's now worth 10 times or more what I paid for it. So, I've ended up being one of the lucky ones, but I'm acutely conscious that people younger than me, they don't have that opportunity to have what I had, and they're really shut out of the market. And people in their 30s, 40s, they just can't buy a place to live that is suitable for themselves, or even especially if they want to bring up a family. Rents are also very expensive. So, I suddenly find myself being on sort of one side of a huge inequality and not feeling very good about it and not really wanting it. I would genuinely like my house to be worth a quarter of what it is, so long as all other houses were a quarter of what they were. I don't want to unilaterally lose that wealth, but I would, if all houses were much, much cheaper, I would be happier. Because the sort of dumb thing about this kind of wealth is, that you can't actually use it, you can't access it, unless you want to sort of diminish your home. So, if you sell up your house, you cash in on the profits, you take yourself off the property ladder, and you can't get back on it again at the same level. So I write in my book, it's a weird kind of wealth that means so much to the people who don't have it, and so little to the people who do have it. So in other words, if you're not an owner, then your life is really dominated by that fact, or it has a huge effect on your life, that your place to live is just very, very problematic. But if you are an owner and you have these sort of zeros on your bank account, or not your bank account, but your sort of theoretical wealth, you can't sort of really use it. So it's just a very mad, strange situation. So it prompted me to write this book, which looks in a sort of partly a global and historical way, and this idea of property, which is very much taken for granted, and of course has its roots in really ancient, the Romans had ideas of property. It's not exactly an invention of modern times, but it has modern characteristics. And I come from a culture which regards property owning as a very good thing. I'm not a communist. I don't believe in the abolition of property, but it made me see that the ways in which the big promise of property, that it makes you rich and it sets you free, both as an individual and as a society, has quite a lot of flaws in it. And allied to that is the idea that property is natural, which comes from 17th century philosophers, especially John Locke, that it's somehow almost given by God that you can own things. And it's not, it's a useful social instrument. Doesn't come from God, it doesn't come from nature. And I'll just lastly say, because there's lots more to talk about, and a very interesting feature of that is when in the 17th century philosophers developed this idea that property was an ownership of property, private ownership of property was natural. Property for them meant, above all, agricultural land. So property was linked to food and linked to survival and life. So land was the thing that you live off, and therefore owning it was as important as your ownership over your kind of limbs, over your own body. And now, of course, when people in a country like Britain talk about property, their first thought is housing land. But it's those ideas that come from land being agricultural have shifted into residential land without anyone really adjusting the assumptions behind it.
Which is a very good platform for us to spring off from, I think, for the rest of the discussion, because thank you both very much for that. Absolutely fascinating. There are so many myths involved in all of this, and you've laid out some of them. And in fact, the subtitle of the book, Property, is The Myth That Built the World. And in a way, I suppose there are lots of myths about country living as well in the UK, lots of romantic, nostalgic ideas, which I think are particularly highly developed in the UK. So maybe we'll talk about that first of all. I mean, is that the fact that we have this sentimental idea of the English countryside and, all of us, carrying our milk in not in bottles and so on, and you getting up early and milking cows, which
I didn't do that.
Which you don't do. So tell us about these myths, do you think, from your point of view?
Oh, I think they're long-standing. You could go back to Wordsworth and, talk to some Cumbrian sheep farmers about the consequence of Wordsworth. And James Rebanks is incredibly, I'd recommend him highly. He was a New York Times bestseller, but he is a Cumbrian farmer who wrote 2 books. The first one was called The Shepherd's Life, and I understand that the working title for it was F.U.C.K. Wordsworth, the original, because of this idea of this sort of bucolic, mythical, fantastic a place that fulfills you spiritually, romantically, creatively, and literally with the food that you create by farming it, when of course farming is extraordinarily hard, unromantic, smelly, dirty.
So it's
long.
detrimental, this whole nostalgic, for all of it, people are still doing it all the time. Well, the books that sell, the ideas that sell.
And that's because I wouldn't say it's detrimental, no, because there is a reason that all of the people in this book are farming extraordinarily long hours all year round for not much money. And it's because they get something more from it than they would get behind a computer, significantly more. And there is also a reason why there is this sort of back to the land resurgence amongst millennials, completely tied in with their absolute inability to buy a property, and thinking, what am I all doing it for anyway? Why am I working incredibly long hours to buy an extraordinarily small flat in the middle of a polluted city where, in London certainly, despite efforts to clean up the air and make low speed-restricted areas, you still had, I think she was 10, a girl who died of the first proven air-related death last year. So growing up or bringing up children in the city for millennials who can't even afford to get a garden is a less appealing prospect. And there is this resurgence of people who are wanting that romantic back to the land, but they are also connected. They are taking their laptops with them, and they are setting up hot desks in cow barns, and sometimes commuting back to the city for 2 days a week. And it's not just in England. I think in Italy, the only industry that has seen a rise, a very modest one, I should say, but a rise in young people going into it is agriculture. And I having been to many, many farm meetings and events, I can tell you the demographic at events which are organized around regenerative agriculture, around basically growing food in a way that enhances and works with natural systems rather than against it, is such a kind of hopeful message that it's filled with young people. There's a farming festival, and it is a festival, there's music and stuff, in June, called Groundswell. And it's gone from 450 farmers in a shed 6 years ago to 8,000 people. Prince William was there last year. Most of all political parties are represented. And it is, I'd say the average kind of demographic is maybe 35 to 55. There's a lot of kids dragging their dads there, saying, I promise there are other people trying to do this. So, yeah, there is this kind of romantic myth, which of course is based on a landscape which in some parts is Capability Brown man-made landscape, as opposed to your neighbours in Sussex, Knepp, which is wild landscape. But it's not entirely made up in terms of what people are finding they get from leaving the city, returning to growing food, returning to being able to eat something which tastes so completely different from what they buy in a plastic pellet in the supermarket that it's almost like it's a different vegetable or fruit.
I think the narrative has changed so much, particularly in the last few years. And in fact, it needs to change even more, because what you're describing is in the reality of what's happening in the UK. And I think most people don't realize, in fact, how much it's changed already. And I know we talk about Brexit obviously we talk about Brexit a lot. We're all very delighted, by the way, to be back in Europe with all of you. But we also talk about COVID and the changes that happened in COVID, which were, again, extreme. And many of them have prevailed, such as the working from home notion. I mean, I now live in the countryside, and I must say I was dragged out kicking and screaming because I loved London. I love the city. I love them both. I was brought up in Cornwall. Now, Cornwall, as a result of Brexit and COVID, has also changed. The narrative has changed. It's the little bit of England at the foot of the country, which is very beautiful. But it's also had not necessarily a farming revolution, because there were lots of farmers down there, but it's definitely had a local revolution, I think, where people are buying, working more locally as opposed to just in cities. And I think that's a narrative that is happening across the country, isn't it?
Well, you don't make any money really as a farmer now. So there was a report that came out last year that said that of the value of the food that you take off the supermarket shelf, a farmer can get as little as 1%. But they have carried all the risk, of course. You know, you plant your seed, plant your winter wheat in autumn, and you won't know whether it's going to have worked or not until the following summer. And you have potentially put a huge amount of money into that, growing that wheat. So they carry all of the risk, the droughts, the floods. I mean, we can look at this week alone with an entire year's rainfall in Spain happening in one day, Cuba without any power, California on fire. That's just in the last week. So all of these climate risks are applying to farmers on the front line. So the only way of sort of buffering that a bit, if you're a farmer, is to sell it directly to the public, to get yourself out of this industrial model that allows you to take all the risk, but takes all the financial reward. And people moving out of the city into the countryside, even if it's for second homes, provides a market for that, as does connectivity, because it's kind of never been easier to set up your own farm shop in a way. You can just get a little kind of portable device that you can take to farmers' markets, you can take to the side of the road, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of regulations stopping you just, I don't know, butchering a pig and then offering it in a burger. You can't do that. But, although I know some people who've tried. But you know, there's a big kind of push for direct selling, because that's how you keep the value in what you're selling. And part of that big push, for example, has been mobile abattoirs, which I spoke to the person who is trying to push it. I spoke to her about 6 years ago, and there's something like, I don't know, I'm making this up, but 150 different bits of law that apply to abattoirs, which is why you cannot have one. But last year at Groundswell, they had a demonstration of one. So you can have essentially a small holding. You can have maybe a herd of 20 cows, and it is going to, at the moment, it's not very cost effective to have to drive a cow a very long distance to the abattoir to have it killed and then back again. So all of the combination of connectivity, tech, the ability to sell stuff yourself, a big kind of push of people saying, no, we really need this if we're going to keep the value of our products, and an influx of, as we would call them, down from London's, DFLs, or people who are leaving the city, even if it's only for the weekends or for part-time, because they are bringing their aspirations for foods and flat whites with them.
Now, Rowan, that's had an impact on London life as well, of course, because some of it's not as much of a divide as we sometimes describe it as at all, between town or city and country. And I think a lot of what has happened in the countryside recently, in the last few years, has actually transferred back to the city, where there's much more of talk of sustainable cities at last. Tell us about what's happened.
Yeah, I mean, I'd
to
say
London
the talk about
recent
sustainable
years.
cities has also come from within the cities and has for quite some time. I mean,
Tell us about both sides then of that sort
okay,
of
I mean, it's a sort of paradoxical situation. So in southern England, southeast England, you have London, which is immense concentration of people and wealth. And then you have countryside around it, which has farms and animals and trees and fields, but which also is very much in the orbit of the London economy. So a lot of people in that larger area commute, or they're retired people who have retired from London. They're down from London's, as Sarah just said, people who have sort of chosen to move out. And so there's this kind of interdependence between the city and the countryside in this particular sort of pretty large chunk of England. But there is also a genuine sort of cultural split. So people where I grew up, which is, as I say, 100 kilometres from London, takes an hour and a half or less to get there. But, if their children go to London for the evening, they really think they're going to be stabbed, They really see, or some of them do, I don't want to generalise too much. They really see London as kind of Sodom and Gomorrah, this sort of terrible hellhole where terrible things are going to happen.
And there are people who don't leave London, and there are people who don't go to London. So there's...
And also, in terms of just ethnic diversity, I mean, it's just absolutely phenomenal difference. Again, travelling this 100 kilometres, you see very few people who are not white in the countryside, and in London, half the population is not white. So that's also very striking. And then this plays out in property because, partly because of this sort of sentimentality about the countryside that we were just talking about. I mean, there's this huge paradox in Britain more generally, which is we were the first country to industrialize and urbanize. So for the last 200 years, we've been an intensely industrial and urban country. And then, as a reaction to that, there's been this poetic, romantic, sentimental love of the countryside. So English culture is really identified with the countryside ahead of cities, even though we have not that many people living in the countryside as a percentage of the population compared with other countries. So that's
less than in many other countries of Europe. I mean, much less. Majority.
I mean, we're one of the most
cities.
Yeah. So that's a sort of paradoxical thing. This then plays out in terms of property. So we have planning laws, very powerful planning laws, which are to do with protecting the countryside, which grows out of this romantic love of the countryside. So we have a thing called the Green Belt, which I was talking about last night, which is around London and the other cities. There's a big area where it's very, very restricted. Building is very, very restricted in order to protect green space. And the London Green Belt is 3 times the area of London itself. So it's a very big piece of land. And so inside London, you have very big pressure for building new homes because there's not enough of them, they're too expensive. The population's increasing. The population of London has increased by 50% since the 1980s. That's all held within this kind of constriction that's very fiercely enforced. And now, and it's kind of reaching a kind of critical point, people are saying, well, hang on a minute, could we not build some housing on the green belt, on green spaces? And the people who live in the green belt absolutely don't want it, because the reason they live there is they like being able to see fields and trees and cows, and who can blame them? So and that's become a very big cultural battle that is really hotting up now, because the Labour government is saying, well, we are going to build things in the green belt. And so that's where we are now.
We have a new government and housing, and it's now called officially the housing crisis, dominates very much what our new government is. They've obviously taken that head on, as they have farming as well. There's been already some indication that farmers are going to be affected by new possible new government policy. Can you just tell us briefly about that and how it's going to impact farmers?
Well, it's tax. It's like, it's a budget proposal, so it's not yet law. And it's been simmering for a long time. In England, or in the United Kingdom, if you agricultural land, you don't pay inheritance tax on, which is how you create the family farm. You pass it down from generation to generation, which completely allows us to continue our sort of romantic ideas about farming. There's plenty of farmers that I've met who are farmers because they've inherited it, not because they want to be. In my own family, I'd say that's probably the case. But that is, that's probably, he'd be very cross with me saying that, so I shouldn't say that. But there is a tradition of this which is enabled by agricultural land being exempt. That's what's been changed. So there is a proposal that you will now pay inheritance tax on agricultural land worth more than £1 million at a capped rate, 20%. The land prices in England are so high, so much higher than the value of the produce that you will get off it. It's the land that's the asset, not what you can grow on it. They are so high and so unaffordable because, as Rowan's already said, basically land is power, ownership is power, that most farms are going to be worth over £1 million once you factor it all in. So it will impact a huge amount of farms. But the idea behind it is to stop people using it as a tax dodge by buying land so that they don't have to pay tax on it and having no interest in how it's farmed. Getting the whole lot farmed by contractors who will farm on a schedule and have no real interest either in the food, where it's going, if most of it's going, as half of our grains do, to feed herbivores, I should say, but, to feed animals. So there is the potential. It's caused, as you would imagine, quite the furore in the headlines. There's been lots of kind of very angry headlines about how it's going to be the death of the family farm. I think the death of the family farm happened when the industrialization of agriculture happened. There is the potential, if it means that land prices go down, that it will be far less appealing for pension funds or billionaires to buy up land as a way to lock up a tax exemption. And that might well bring down the price of land, which might well mean that actually family farms who find a field or two coming up next to them are, for the first time in a long time, actually able to afford it. This doesn't help. There's lots of kind of snags within it. A third of all farms are tenanted. They don't own the land that they farm, and they might have farmed that for multiple generations. My uncle's farm is a tenant farm, locked into an old-fashioned 3-generation one. So there's lots of kind of snags within it. But the reality is that our land is worth way more than its true value. There's another tax which is directly linked to property called the rollover tax. No one really knows about it. I don't even know if Rowan knows about it.
I do not. No,
It is, if you sell land, if you're a farmer and you sell land to a property developer, for example, who's quite enthusiastic about it because they can make a lot of money by putting houses on it, and therefore overpays for it. If you buy more land within 3 years, you don't pay any capital gains tax on it. So there is an incentive to buy something really quickly and overpay for it, because it's worth overpaying for land. You get more, you'll end up with more money in your account if you overpay for land than if you end up having to pay capital gains tax on it. So that also has hugely inflated what land is actually worth, locking out a whole generation of people who do want work and meaning and life and purpose. This millennial generation are locked out of the property market and think, why do I want that anyway? I want to do something real, usually tied up with climate change, because they're a generation who has grown up with it and are not deniers. And they are locked out of this overpriced landmass. So it's caused a lot of very angry farmers to go on the airwaves. But I think there is the potential for it to be gigantic in terms of unlocking land to people, to farmers, some first generation, some not, who would never have been able to afford it before the land prices come down.
And this is fascinating, I think, on so many different levels, because what's happening in England, of course, is happening in many other countries as well. And if we go back to the city briefly, not that I'm trying to in any way cement that divide between country and city, because I don't see it in the same way, possibly, as you do. But the city also is about to face some really major changes as far as property ownership. I mean, if we're looking at some of the statistics, the new government has already proposed 1.5 million new houses because there is a dearth of housing, of affordable housing. And in fact, the other big problem in the UK is this so-called real estate inflation, luxury condos and so on, and there's been a significant rise in homelessness as well. So in London, in many cities, we do have a major problem, and this government pretty much had it, you know, sort of up there at the front of the manifesto that they would be dealing with this. I wonder, let's hear also from both of you. You've both got readings for us. Perhaps from you, first of all, Rowan. You've got a reading specifically about Britain and London, I think.
Yeah, so this is really describing this kind of inequality that I was talking about that has been created by 40, 50 years of the property-owning democracy. Sorry, is my thing coming? I'll just not touch it and hope it stays there. Imagine a country where homeless individuals and young families are sent to live in office blocks badly converted into homes, some in high slabs, some located in business parks, surrounded by polluting and dangerous roads, far from shops and public transport, in flats so small that, according to one mother, my eldest daughter has to read her school books in the toilet so she doesn't wake the little one, where children arrive at school exhausted by their long journeys there, and where they are stigmatized for where they live. Office block kids, they are called. In the same country, it has been legal for developers to build houses that have no windows, or that are, at 13 square meters, little bigger than a standard parking place. If you have a job, you might have to spend 60% of your income on rent. If you are old and rent, you might be among the 25% who live in fear of losing your home. If you are in an abusive relationship, you might find it impossible to escape. If you are in theory well off, say a professional age 40, you might still have no prospect of owning your own home and face a lifetime renting overpriced, poor quality and insecure accommodation. This country is Britain, 5th or 6th richest in the world, depending on which measure you use. It is a place where the romance of houses and gardens is strong, where the Englishman's home is reportedly his castle, a country famous for its domestic architecture. The British inventions of the garden suburb and the Georgian townhouse have been exported around the world, and you can find Tudor manors, country houses, Scottish castles, or arts and crafts cottages in California and Shanghai and Buenos Aires. In 1904, a German architect and diplomat thought new British houses so exemplary that he published a book, Das Englische Haus, so that his own country might learn from them. In 1934, a Danish architect, Stein Eiler Rasmussen, wrote that, quote, "The one family house, open-air life, and all that we others admire and are fain to imitate is inseparable from the English mode of thought of life." Britain is also the country that has led the world these last 40 years in a social, political, and economic experiment called the property-owning democracy. It was based on the idea that property would make you a better and happier person. It responded to the simple, reasonable, and powerful desire of very many people to own their own home. Property-owning democracy would make you prosperous. It would set you free.
Thank you very much indeed. And if we just, off the back of that, I mean, this is a wonderful overview of property, and not just of cities, but cities around the world. You go to Las Vegas, you go to Baku, you go to all over the place, and Vienna, of course, wonderful Vienna. And I wonder what you see, how you see London by comparison with other cities around the world, and what's happening now. Because if we're all moving to cities, if cities are growing, how is London faring?
Well, the interesting thing about London is it's a European city, but which is subject to some of the same forces that you see in some Asian cities and some American cities. So, we have this historic, very strong historic structure, but you're also getting, as a big population increase, and you're also getting this kind of international capital flowing in and being invested in speculative property. So in London now, they are building towers of apartments that are in pretty similar to what's being built in Dubai and Shanghai, and often by the same architects, the same engineers, the same construction companies, and the same property companies. And the wealth that goes into those is similar to the wealth that goes into property in Dubai and Shanghai. And it's international, it's quite often criminal. It doesn't have much to do with Britain or London as a place. So I think, London is interesting for the way it combines this sort of European situation with this global situation. And then, the interest of Vienna especially, also some other European cities, is the very strong culture of public housing. And in Britain, we also have a strong history of public housing. In fact, we also kind of invented that in the 19th century. The first city to build what's now called social housing was Liverpool, followed by London. And if we're looking for a way out of the current situation, then I would strongly argue that public housing has to be a big part of that, because the market is simply not succeeding at providing what everyone needs. And by the way, social housing is the most incredible invention. If you look at the history of ownership and housing, it's not very often that a new idea comes along and really works. It happens every few centuries. But social housing was one of those. So this idea did not exist 200 years ago, and it was brought into being, and now a lot of people in a lot of different places around the world live in social housing, and it has problems, but it also works in many places. And by the way, what's attractive about, to outsiders, one of the many things that's attractive about the Viennese model is the fact that lots of different people from different parts of society live in housing, in public housing that belongs to the city. So it's not, which was the dream in Britain. We had a government after the Second World War that wanted to build a lot of council housing, as we call it, public housing, social housing. And the dream was absolutely that people with all sorts of different backgrounds and jobs and levels of income could live in it. But it became what's called housing of last resort. In other words, more and more it came to serve the poorest, neediest, most desperate people. And that has created problems, that there's a huge divide between whether you live in council housing or not. That also makes a very big kind of class distinction. It wasn't meant to be there.
You speak about dreams and reality too. And I don't want in any way to cement the divide between city and country, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to improve lives in the whole country, in the whole of the world, the whole of Europe. But to go back specifically to your ideas and your book and how you see the world, tell us about your farming and what you think that is going to, your regenerative farming, but also what's happening to farming in general and how you think that, that England possibly can lead the world.
There's a great quote from the founder of the national parks in America, Jan Muir, which says, I hope I don't misquote it, if you pull something out of the universe, you will find it immediately connected to something else. So I think that's basically the principle behind regenerative farming, but it's also the principle of what we're talking about here, I think, and the argument that I make that for a landmass where 70% of that is looked after farmers, what they do on that land is going to affect everyone. It's not just going to affect the village that's flooded downstream. It's going to affect all of our air quality, our rivers, and the nutritional value of our food, and therefore our health. So everything is connected, even if people sit in their silos and think otherwise. So I suppose in terms of what regenerative farming is that what you would like me to...
But also, yeah, and also, I mean, we've spoken about the fact that immigration and multiculturalism, as we call it as well, is happening more in the cities. Is there a way that we can make the country and the city come together in that way? Because, I mean, I live in Wiltshire now, and you were speaking about, you know, in the countryside, we hardly see any black or Asian non-white faces, and it's absolutely the case. I mean, it's as though I am in a different world, and I'm literally just an hour's train journey from London. Can we bring those two together? Can we marry the two?
There are lots of groups trying that to get people of colour, not only physically out of cities, because if you don't own a car, train fares are so extraordinarily expensive that you literally can't even get there, even if you wanted to, but also to feel comfortable in the countryside when you're the only person of colour walking through a field. Those in that position say they are extraordinarily aware of that. So there are various groups that are trying to work on it, and some of the public levers for it are relatively interesting at the moment. Paying farmers to do educational visits, for example, that's been going on for a bit. I know various farmer friends who do that, and that's been ring-fenced in this budget. And then the other one that I'm the most interested in, which has started to be piloted 3 years ago, in areas that have got a very high city density and targeting the kind of farmers around the edges, is something called green prescribing. So you go to your doctor because you are depressed, and rather than a prescription for pills, they give you a prescription to go for a walk. And it has an 87% take-up. I mean, it's a membership to English Heritage, or the ability basically to have something which allows you access to land, which is exactly what we were talking about. Access to land is controlled by those who own it. And we have more public footpaths and rights of way in England than in many other countries, particularly the States. But you can't just walk across someone's field. And probably if there are animals in it, shouldn't. But the ability to say to people who we now have swathes of evidence coming in about what actually happens in your brain when you're in nature, from what happens emotionally to the fungal spores that are released when you tread on when you go through woodland and mulch, when you breathe them in, they activate the same part of your brain that releases serotonin. So there's plenty of kind of growing evidence about how being surrounded by green improves tangibly your mental health. And so that, as a way of linking up city and country, is a really interesting one. And I've been talking to people who are in charge of land either side of cities about how to do exactly that.
What have you, I mean, there's so much in this book too that we haven't had a chance in both books not to talk about, but I'd like you to end this session, if you would, by reading from your book, because you reflect very much on farming and identity and what you personally have learned from adopting this, because you're a farmer and you live in the city and in the country now. You do both, don't you?
We have done, yeah, since 2019, yeah.
So it's a long time.
Yeah.
And so what would your conclusions be? I know you're quite messianic about farming now and talking about the importance of farming, and I think it's fantastic. We hear you, and it's important.
Well, I suppose this part of the book is where I really try to understand what the word farmer means and explore how it relates to the rest of us. Because 2 generations ago, everyone would have known a farmer. If you weren't a farmer yourself, you would have known one. Now that's very much not the case. Now we don't really even look at the packet of where our food came from. We buy our South African blueberries in January and think that that's completely normal. And so I suppose I was trying to unpick the word and show how the word relates to all of us, how all of us are dependent on people that we will never meet or know, how they grow what keeps us alive. But I'm starting to realize that while farming has always been about care of the land, stewardship, and husbandry, the truth is that for all the trees and bees, we still need farmers to grow our food. With supply chains threatened by politics, pandemics, and climate change, this food needs to be as local to us as possible. But in a world where microplastics produced by fossil fuels can be found atop the highest mountains and in the deepest sea trenches, we need farmers to grow our fiber too. We need them to grow our trees and hedgerows and plants, not just for wood, but to clean our air and provide homes for some of the creatures that form part of our ecosystem. We need farmers to create habitats for insects, for they are at the bottom of the food chain and support the rest of life, and therefore us. We need them to grow flowers for pollinators because over 1/3 of the world's crops depend upon them. We need them to maintain soil full of fungi and microbacterial life because these tiny living things now turn out to be critical for so much of the way our world works. Some think even for the weather. But there is something else we need our farmers for, something that is both intangible and unsellable, and which stitches together the fabric of communities with a thread that goes back hundreds of years, sewing our future to our past. We need them to remain the cornerstones of our countryside for all those who live and work and visit there. We need someone to remember how to lay a hedge or a dry stone wall and leave a hog hole for sheep and small children to escape through. We need someone to push the snowplow in winter and wield the chainsaw after an autumn storm. We need someone to stand in the pulpit at the funeral of the last of a generation and tell the story of what it is to lead a quiet and useful life to a congregation with swimming eyes. We need someone to remember the old names and the old ways and teach them to us so that we can know them too, because they rarely find their ways into textbooks or agricultural universities. I'm starting to think that maybe it's not so much that the definition of farming is changing, but that it is reverting. Is a farmer actually someone who uses their land to provide what their community needs? Food, fiber, and fuel, but also oxygen, ecosystems, clean water, and soil that is biologically alive enough to work with plants and grazing animals to lock up carbon and cool the planet for us? And is a farmer not also someone who can care for the land so that those who are able might leave the grey concrete of the city behind for a moment, stand on a hillside, and feel their hearts tighten as they remember that the world, and much within it, is truly extraordinary?
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this session. I think you'll agree, absolutely fascinating. And both these books, I cannot, as I say, recommend them highly enough. Property and Rooted. I'm going to put them together. They do belong together, as do these two. It's been really wonderful hearing you both. Thank you so much to Sarah Langford and Rowan Moore. And do join us later. The conversation continues, and I'm sure they'll be around as well to continue any questions you might have. Thank you again both very much indeed. Thank you, all of you.
Quickly.